Good evening. Thank you for joining us and thank you for waiting. My name is Serena Danna. I am new media editor of La Lettura, the cultural supplement of Corriere della Sera. I'm here today. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Frank Rose. Frank Rose is a digital anthropologist and the author of The Art of Immersion, that actually is published in Italy by Codice Edizioni with the title of Immersi nelle Storie. Rose writes about the impact of technology on advertising, society, and culture, and he writes for several magazines and newspapers, including New York Times Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Mr. Rose.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really nice to be here. The Hobbit. I was reminded the other day that story worlds are really kind of all around us now. When I flew here from LA by way of London, and the first leg of my flight was on Air New Zealand, and I looked out at the plane and it said the Airline of Middle Earth on it. And it had hobbits and such all over the sides. And I thought, apparently I've entered a story world already just by buying a ticket. We think of story worlds as a very internet-era concept, but of course, Tolkien was inventing them 80 years or so ago. An Oxford Don, of course, authority on Old and Middle English, who started inventing languages as a teenager, and in his 40s created the world of Middle-earth in a story that he told his children. And of course, he invented not just the land and its inhabitants, the hobbits, the dwarves, the elves, and so forth, but languages, pronunciation guides, maps, even genealogical charts. A few years later, he talked about worlds like this in a lecture that he gave at St. Andrews called On Fairy Stories. To Tolkien, the world builder creates a secondary world, as he called it. And what has to happen in this secondary world is that everything has to be true. Everything has to true to the internal logic of that world. So it can be fantastical, but it does have to follow certain internal laws. But the real point of it is that it's a world that you can enter with your mind. Now, this was great for Tolkien. He lived in a world of books. But what's happening now is that the internet is creating a form of storytelling that's participatory. And that means that readers not only want to be able to enter it in their imagination, they want to do stuff there. And this raises all kinds of questions like, what sort of stuff? How is this supposed to work? What does this mean for the author? And who's the author anyway? Now, I understand the impulse to say these things. First off, I write stories myself. And secondly, there's a picture I don't have here, but it's a picture I remember quite well. It's a picture of me, a photo of me that my parents took when I was 7 years old. It was Christmas morning, and I'd just gotten the model train, and it was set up in front of the tree. And my little cousins had come over. In this photo, one of them is reaching for the caboose, and you can see me shooting daggers at him with my little 7-year-old eyes. Because, you know, the truth is this was kind of a clumsy child, and I really didn't want him wrecking my train. But in fact, the cousin didn't destroy my train set, and readers are not really going to destroy our stories. The reason they want to enter stories is because that's what we've always done with stories that we love, whenever the technology has permitted it. We want to take that story and make it our own. We want to live in that world, at least for a little while. That's been the case since stories began. Back when the idea of printed books, or at least printed books that weren't the Bible, was still new, Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, a satire about a man who immersed himself in tales that were set in the age of chivalry. Cervantes wrote, "He so buried himself in his books that he read all night from sundown to dawn, and all day from sunup to dusk, until with virtually no sleep and so much reading, he dried out his brain and lost his sanity." So Don Quixote, as it happens, was a guy who lost his mind from reading too much. Thinking he was a knight errant, he went out tilting at windmills. But despite Cervantes' cautionary tale, people kept recklessly reading, immersing themselves in stories, and never mind the consequences. So this brings us a couple of hundred years later to this fellow. This is Dickens at 27. 1839, he had just published Oliver Twist. And I bring him up because he's really the best model we have, or certainly one of the best models, of participatory storytelling. At the time, England was undergoing massive, overwhelming technological change. Industrialization, people were moving from the countryside to the cities in droves. Because that's where they could find work, but they had to live in appalling and truly miserable conditions. The population was disoriented, confused. All the old ways were changing. New industries were springing up, and old industries were dying. In other words, except for the sanitary conditions, it's not too much unlike the situation today. Now, there was one change, however, that was very good for publishing, which was that the literacy rate was going up rather dramatically. In 1830, it was estimated that 50% of the male population of England was literate. By 1840, that had reached 67% of men and 50% of women. This meant that authors and publishers had a whole new audience. The problem, though, was that the people in this audience didn't have much money. Nonetheless, there was new technology that meant things like improved paper manufacture, better printing presses, railways, which made distribution much easier. And publishers, being entrepreneurial, saw this as an opportunity. So what they came up with was a way of selling books essentially on the installment plan. Serial fiction, they published novels in installments, a few chapters a month, and it was cheap enough for almost anyone to afford. Many, many authors published this way, but Dickens was soon sort of the acknowledged master of it. Now, Dickens, of course, knew the world of his readers because it was essentially the kind of world that he'd grown up in. His father had been locked away in a debtor's prison. He was pulled out of school and put to work in a rat-infested bootblack factory in London. When he had success as a writer, it was entirely unexpected. First he was a newspaper journalist, then he was an essayist, and eventually as a novelist, famous for the story of this little orphan boy in a workhouse who dares to say, "Please, sir, I want some more." And of course, what he wanted was more gruel. Now, Okay. As I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a book by a guy in New York named Jeff Jarvis. Now, the book was called What Would Google Do? And it's intended for business people who are trying to find their way in a networked world. And Jarvis's idea was that they should turn for guidance to a company that had leveraged this networked world more effectively than any other. So I thought I would ask, what would Dickens do? And so what would Dickens do? I mean, he too came along at a time when technology permitted immersive storytelling and in a way, a participatory relationship with the story. It was very different from what came in between him and us. The technology of the industrial age allowed publishers for the first time to reach millions of people at once. It created whole industries, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, movies, and of course book publishing as we've known it up until now. But it did not allow the audience to connect with one another, and it certainly didn't allow them to connect in any meaningful way with the author. And certainly not for readers or viewers to enter the world of the story, except in their own imagination. The technology of the 1830s and 40s did, because that was an unforeseen consequence of serialization. The time between stories, installments rather, the month that passed, gave readers a voice, a chance to reach out to the author. And some authors, Dickens in particular, were eager to take advantage of this. Most of his novels came out in monthly installments, but for a while, when he was 29, he started this magazine, Master Humphrey's Clock, which came out not monthly but weekly, and he described it, referring to himself in the third person, as to shorten the intervals of communication between himself and his readers. That's how enthusiastic he was about this. Now, in fact, weekly deadlines are hard, so this didn't last terribly long. But he did keep publishing in monthly installments pretty much throughout his career. Over time, however, when Dickens and serials as well were pretty much long gone, people forgot about this connection with his readers, except his biographers, of course. They knew how he drew sustenance from the constant give and take. Like readers today, his readers wanted to have a voice. He didn't always heed their wishes. The old curiosity shop caused pandemonium when it became apparent that the saintly little Nell wasn't going to make it. A ship from England sailing into New York Harbor was greeted by a mob of people at the dock who were crying, "Is little Nell dead?" And of course she was. But Dickens knew what he was doing in this case. The book was an immense success. In cases where he was losing his way a bit, he paid much more attention to what people said they wanted. Martin Chuzzlewit, for example, wasn't selling, so he moved the action to America because people were eager to read about the US. So what would Dickens do? Well, obviously, he'd have a blog. The evidence suggests that it would look sort of like this. No doubt his web skills would have been pretty good, but he still faced occasional technical difficulties. Not to mention the demands of daily publication, though future scholars would see the advantages of audience participation that this gave them too. But everybody these days has a blog. That's sort of like saying he would have gone to Comic-Con. A more interesting possibility is that he might have done like John Lanchester, the English novelist who wrote Capital, which documents the lives of the residents of a single street in London during Britain's ongoing financial crisis. Matlock, who's the ex-head of cross-platform at Channel 4 and now a consultant who works with publishers such as Faber and Faber, created this Pepys Road, which is a sort of online experience that builds out Lanchester's fictional world. As Matt says, the point is to take people inside the story world and into the sort of lost decade that economists are predicting will be the result of government austerity. So he created a sort of a game. You go to the website, you type in the date and the date and place of your birth, rather, and what city you live in now, and you wait for what happens next. And what happens next, among other things, is over a period of a couple of weeks, you get stories, little stories through email from Lanchester himself about how you would be affected by the economic changes that were would be coming in the next 10 days. Another kind of website, not a site about a book, but set in the world of the book, is this one. It's a site for something called the Department of Human Management in the Strain trilogy, which is the series of vampire novels by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro, the film director. In volume 3, called The Night Eternal, the vampires have taken over. And the guy who created this told me, you can imagine what this means, reading the book, but you're not quite sure. So he wanted to focus on this world-building aspect. The authors had created this world, they had imagined it, but he wanted to think it through. What would life be like if you actually lived in it? So this was a DHM poster. There were many other sort of fun things on this site, including my personal favorite was an interview with a young couple who had B-positive blood, I think it was, and their job was to make babies for the vampires to eat. And of course, ultimately we have Pottermore, the world of Harry Potter that's been created essentially from J.K. Rowling's notes, which raises the question, would Dickens have given us Oliver more? I don't know. But I'm kind of fascinated by this online seminar that Robert Patton gave a few years ago. It was called, When is a Book Not a Book? It's about Oliver Twist in the context of Bentley's Miscellany, the monthly journal that Dickens edited and in which Oliver Twist appeared. His point was that Oliver Twist as a serial novel is very different from Oliver Twist, the bound book. So when is a book not a book? When it ceases to be an artifact and becomes a living, breathing work of art. The truth is, we've all been trained to like our books dead, finished, completed. But our readers aren't really all that excited about dead books anymore. They are being trained to think of books in an entirely different way, as story worlds, worlds that are full of characters and events that spark the imagination. They don't want to take over the story. They want the story to embrace them and let them in. So we have to ask ourselves, as authors and as publishers, are we in the artifact business? Are we trying to create an object of genius for everyone to admire? Or are we in the business of communicating with our readers? Are we like that little kid with a train set? Or are we going to share our gift with others? And if it's the latter, how do we do that? I don't have the answers here, but I do think that these are the questions. We're all sort of still groping our way toward a new relationship with our readers. And that's the job we have now. Not every generation has an opportunity to do anything like this, but I find it pretty exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. So, you wrote in the book that the web has not only changed the way in which we consume art, but the art we consume.
Yes.
What does it mean? I mean, can you explain that?
Sure. Well, I think that's been the truth with every medium, every form of communications technology. In the case of the internet, I think what's happening is that it's making stories, it's encouraging stories to be nonlinear, participatory, as I've discussed just now, and immersive. We've always wanted to immerse ourselves in stories. This just gives us new ways of doing so. But the same sort of thing happened with cinema, for example. The motion picture camera was invented around 1890, and it was a good 25 years before everything that we take for granted now is the grammar of cinema, you know, cuts, pans, fades, stuff other than just the simple point of view shots, became integrated into what we now consider feature-length films with actual movie stars. That didn't happen overnight. And what I've found is that every time a new technology like this has come along, television, for example, it's taken people 20, 30 years to figure out what to do with it. We're now about 20 years into the web, and I think we're on our way, but still have a ways to go.
Thank you. Have you ever watched a series called The House of Cards?
I actually haven't watched it yet, but,
okay.
But it's on my queue.
Okay. Because I was thinking about The House of Cards. I don't know if you know. It's like the first. It's the Netflix debut in original programming. It's a remake of a very old TV series, British TV series, and actually we can call it the first big data series, because Netflix, that is like a streaming platform, having studied its user logs, discovered that a remake of the British series could be a huge hit, especially if featured Kevin Spacey and directed by David Fincher. And so they did, and it was great, because actually it is one of the most interesting series at the moment. So my question is, Mr. Rose, how can the author survive in an age when computer algorithms are the ultimate focus group?
Well, you know, I'm not sure that computer algorithms are any better or worse as a focus group than or more reliable, for that matter, than the people you normally get for focus groups. You know, I think focus groups are whoever is or whatever is in them tend to be a little scary as a creative person. You know, I'm reminded of Steve Jobs, who famously refused to do focus groups for the products that Apple was introducing, because his point was that if people didn't know what a technology was going to be, they couldn't know if they were going to want it or not. There was no way they could answer that question intelligently. And I think it's the same with you know, a work of art. It's exactly the same situation.
Any question from the audience? No. So, as we are in a festival about the future of books, my last question for you will be about the book itself. So, what's your idea for the future of books?
I think, well, there's certainly been many interesting ideas here today. I think that, you know, one of the fascinating things about the internet, aside from the obvious one that it's, you know, participatory, that invites people to communicate with one another, makes it possible to communicate with the author and so forth, is that it's really the first medium that we've ever had that subsumes all other media. We are used to, or we were used to, you know, when you wanted to watch a TV program, you turned on the TV. If you wanted to watch a movie, you went to the movie theater, or, you know, more recently, maybe you'd rent a DVD. If you wanted to listen to the radio, you would turn on a radio. And if you wanted to read a book, you would pick up a book. That's not the case anymore. You know, you can do all of these things, and any of them, online, whether through, you know, through the web directly or through a tablet or something like that. So I think there's no question that the, you know, what we consider books is going to change, because it's no longer going to be exclusively written. There have been some experiments, not all of them terribly good, with you know, incorporating video into novels and that sort of thing. I think it probably has more, will have more success in nonfiction, but I think that just the idea that you know, that we can get information in all sorts of different ways, you know, whether it's an app like the app for Warhorse, the children's novel that Egmont just recently put out in the UK. This is an app where you can get all kinds of information about, you know, not just horses, but the conduct of World War I and what life was like for humans as well and so forth. It's not all that pleasant, as it turns out.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Roos.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone. Bye.